Hi everyone, welcome to the April 25th edition of API Machinery. We have 3 items on our agenda, but they might take a while, so let's get started. David and or Clayton, you're first up.
Yeah, so we added paging to the API a few releases back. We have some experience now using it. It seems to work pretty well. What we'd like to do is gather requirements people have for taking us from the beta level to GA. So we've seen improvement when you do large list and mutation streaming through the list. Works very well. One of the things that has come up as a potential requirement is trying to expose some of the paging options out through the client. And
do you mean out of the Go client interface or out of the API interface?
Out of the API interface.
Okay.
It is something that we're going to look at and consider. But if other people have more requirements, we'd like to hear them before we try to move anything to GA.
So basically you're saying you need an API review?
Yeah, I mean, presumably people have been using it like we've been using it, and they have a wish list of features and things that they think are shortcomings in the existing beta API. We want to make sure that we've just made it clear. Now's the time. Let's get some comments in.
Maybe you can give like a 30-second or 1-minute overview of how it actually works for the video recording.
Sure. So etcd has a paging feature that allows it to page through the watch window. So the watch window is configurable. I think I don't know what Cube sets it to by default. Our environment's set to 5 minutes still, right, Jordan? Anyway, you can set it to a certain number of minutes. And within that time frame, you can have sort of a cursor saying, I want the list as it appeared at this particular point, and then I'm going to page through to get X number of results. And so we exposed a way with a continue token to do that through the API, but it was just a very minimal exposure.
Do you do that by like a query parameter?
Yes.
Yeah. On the initial list, you specify the size that you want back, and then as part of the response, you can get a continue token. And if you provide that on subsequent ones, it continues from that point.
Right. And is the token something you get from etcd that you pass on directly, or is it?
It is something constructed by the API server, which combines the parameters that you provided that the API server based its query on, and the final, the ending point of the range from etcd, I think. I forget exactly how it's constructed. API-wise, it's opaque to the caller. You have to provide it identically without interpretation on the next
Is it
request.
opaque like our resource versions are opaque, or is it like cryptographically opaque?
It is verified by the API server. It is not something that is easy or useful, I guess, to inspect. So it's yeah, I forget exactly how where the implementation ended up, but it is more opaque than resource version.
It's somewhat obfuscated.
Yeah, I would prefer it to be like clear to users that there's no point in trying to understand it. Unlike our current resource version, which users have taken inappropriate dependencies on, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's far more opaque than resource version.
Okay. Yeah, we were they're trying to gather requirements for paging to go to GA. So, okay. Okay.
But quick question: does the paging also work for the endpoints, like for an individual endpoints object?
An individual endpoint object?
I think the answer is no. Paging is about list queries, and an
That's what I
endpoints
figured.
object is a single object from etcd's perspective. So
Yes.
the answer is no.
Okay, that's fine. You should fix that by fixing it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, we can collect those offline, or is there more you would like
Nope, we can collect them offline, and just wanted to make sure everyone was aware. Didn't want it to be some email nobody read.
You're targeting this for 111?
No strong opinions. It's going to depend on what requirements we get back, right? If you get back requirements that can't be met in 111, then no, we will not put it in 111.
Okay. You might circulate this on the Kubernetes dev list. I don't know if everybody who cares is on the API machinery list.
One query on paging, it doesn't, etcd2 is not supported, which is fine, but I think that means that we can't use it in like Kube Controller Manager until we formally deprecate etcd2, correct?
You can. It's backwards compatible. So if you request paging and the backing storage doesn't support it, you get back the entire list and no continue token.
Cool. So perf impact, but that's fine for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, and reminder, etcd2 is already deprecated and support will be removed at least by the end of the year.
I think we said 113. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Next we have two topics, one from me and one from, I guess, David. I'll summarize that as David. Should we do the storage one first? I think that might be
Sure, if you'd like.
longer than mine. I'm not sure.
So do you want to discuss yours in this meeting or not?
Yes, I do want to discuss mine.
Maybe you should.
Okay. Oh, all right. Fine. So there was a discussion for the apply work. We're adding the apply logic to the control plane in a feature branch. We want to reuse existing code where appropriate, and existing code does merging based on the OpenAPI spec. We're expanding the extension tags in the OpenAPI spec so that it will contain all the information necessary to do merging or do the diffing and merging for apply.
Wait, the primary apply code, the non-alpha apply code at least, was using the tags from the TypeScript files?
That is clearly not going to work, right?
Yes. I'm just saying when
no, Phil has a rewrite of.
Yeah, I just didn't think the rewrite ever got out of alpha.
It's not used today, I don't think.
Okay, so therefore not well tested.
Probably not, and we are planning on testing it extensively. Let me back up a minute. We need some way to get schema information to the code that does the actual apply logic. I don't have a super strong opinion that we should use OpenAPI for that purpose, but it's the thing that is in our code base, and it is like the most obvious way to do it is to thread OpenAPI through. Previously, there's been some hesitancy about embracing more use of OpenAPI. I think to that, I would say we do only care about the data model for this purpose. Don't necessarily, we don't have it, yeah, we don't have any use for the operations in this. One compelling reason to use the data model from OpenAPI is that we have put it in CRDs as the, what do we call it, the validation tag.
Well, the JSON spec part of it.
Yeah, the JSON spec part of it, it's the data model. So that makes it a, like there's like if we introduce extensions and users can put them there and we can put them on basic objects, that has a path to use the same merging code to merge all of our API resources, which I think that sort of unification is what we want. So I don't know. This is going in the feature branch. I suggested, since the first part of it is a pretty innocuous refactor that threads our existing spec into a few more places, that maybe it's
so hang on, I'd be careful about characterizing it that way, right? So rather than, it's not narrowly scoped, right? So the current way, at least what I remember seeing, is taking an open API doc generated for every API group in a single file and pulling that dependency and adding it to code that deals in internal versions with a hope of using it somewhere. So you have an externally versioned thing that is dealing with very broad sets of objects unrelated to the ones that you're currently looking at. And you're plumbing it into a place that doesn't have the external version to deal with. So while I don't object to the idea of of doing, like the purpose you had mentioned was validation for Open API. That doesn't seem like a bad purpose, but the implementation is not a straightforward way of managing that.
So there were comments on the PR, and I don't think we were suggesting that we take it as is without addressing comments. That's a little more detailed than I was hoping to go. The reason I put it on this agenda is I don't want this to surprise people when we go to reintegrate the feature branch.
Can you put a link to the proposal or whatever? In the notes?
Yeah, we can
Later.
Yeah, give me an action item.
Yeah, I mean, at some point we might want to review the current status of the Open API. Also, like originally when we had the Swagger, you could actually pull information for specific APIs, like
Yeah, that actually came up today. Someone was asking how they could get just the schema for a particular resource or a particular group version.
Yeah, and if the size of the API grows, that's going to become increasingly important, especially with CRDs and things like that.
Yeah, we previously talked about serving separate Open API specs for each like subdirectory.
Yeah,
or at least at the group level, group version level, probably.
Yeah, so we probably need a more sophisticated serving and caching model.
Yeah,
at minimum.
Yeah.
The two things that I wanted to call out, I think David touched on one of them, the internal external thing. So if we're wanting to use Open API for validation, to drive validation, then Open API only is expressing schemas for external,
yes,
which makes sense. And I know like external or per version validation has actually been a goal. Some of what we have today doesn't make a lot of sense, but if we want to make Open API participate in validation, I think we should switch validation to be operating on the external versions.
Yeah, I agree completely. That's
of course, there's also the whole question of do we need the internal version or not?
Yeah,
which is maybe too much for this particular.
Yeah, that's
Do we what?
a can of worms we don't need to open today. Yeah, so I agree with things. I think I agree with everything Jordan said, and like at least 95% of what David said. And I still think it's not a terrible idea to thread Open API a little further into our handler stack.
Well, one thing that's entirely unclear right now is what in the internal version. Let's say we didn't use Open API and we just used tags. Yeah, I don't know that the internal version has that information right now.
Correct. The internal version is not as checked as the external version, at least. That's certainly true. It may have some, but it's accidental. Like we wouldn't be.
Yeah, it's just from copy paste mistakes. Basically.
Yeah, I think. I think to do any sort of validation, the schema we validate against has to be the externally versioned schema. Like there's no other reasonable way to do it. You can't include all of the information in the internal schema, like, and still be able to give comprehensible error messages. Like that's a bunch of complexity.
Yeah, I mean, there's benefits both ways. It's clearer. You gain the power to change validation per version if you do on the external. You also, it's easier to give error messages that make sense. It is also easier to miss fixing bugs in validation and let invalid data slip through in one version but not another. So that's a downside that we'd want to figure out how to put tests around or do automated tests or fuzz testing or something to flush that out.
Yeah, and just to unwind a little bit, so one thing David said that I don't think I agree with is that the request scope object is only referring to the internal version. Like I know it's got some information about the external version in there too, because for example, the patch handler, which I just monkeyed with, does a bunch of internal to external to internal conversions in the course of the retries. So
so there is one spot where it is shimmed in, but it is not universal. It is not planned. And if you're going to do something structured where you're going to try to put in a spot to decide how you validate something, you need to take into account internal versus external and have.
But you definitely need to take it into account. There's no question
actually,
about that.
You just brought up a good point, which is strategic merge patch is already supported in the server, and that information is specified on the external type cycle files. We must be doing, and we're planning to put smush this in the patch as well?
Yes, all the merging. Since I know this because I just messed with this code, all the merging for all three flavors of patch happen on the external version of the.
Yes, but you'll notice that where that happens is not the same place that you would be able to inject a validator, right? Because it happens pre-admission. So
actually, the validators are threaded through that code. And they're called, like it converts to the internal version.
They are done via a strategy that gets called via the storage layer, right? And that it happens because you have to be post-admission. If you're going to try to add external validation, I would like to see.
So the naive way to do external validation today is like at the same time we check the validation on the internal version, like also convert to the external version and do a external validation. Like that's kind of
the information isn't present there for where you came from, right? Like so, it's not that it is insurmountable, but it is that those questions should be answered before we start trying to add plumbing because we don't know precisely what plumbing we need.
Is the validation on the external version actually coupled to the apply implementation? Like,
there is no validation on the external version.
I'm not sure how that can work because we also run the admission controllers, which dial out to admission webhooks in some cases, and those are all converted to the external version, which the webhook registered for. So that's interesting. Anyway, this is a rat hole that there's some stuff to be worked out, but I think we have to thread the external version validation. If we're going to do validation in the external version, which it seems like everybody agrees is a good idea, then we have to thread information about the.
It sounds like at minimum that somebody needs to write a doc that says where this information is available and where the translation to internal happens.
It does seem clear that we could use a doc on this. Okay, but we will be reducing the scope of the PR that's out for review right now a little bit because it turns out that that's necessary anyway. And I'm currently planning on just merging into the feature branch, and so consider this an FYI when we go to reintegrate the feature branch. We are in our feature branch keeping a changelog up to date, so hopefully when we're all done, there'll be a concise list of the notable things that we're changing. Okay. Any other comments on this, or shall we go on to the next one? All right, David, do you want to talk about this one?
Sure. So one of the difficulties in working with an aggregated API server is figuring out where to store your data so that you have a consistent place that's easy to back up. And we have decided that we are not going to have a new storage layer introduced in code, right? So we aren't going to accept a pull that adds a new storage layer for managing aggregated API servers or anything, right? We have a storage layer that works against etcd, and we aren't going to change that. The thing that we can...
I don't know if that's...
Let him finish his intro.
So the thing that is possible to do is to go through, and there is actually an etcd proxy, gRPC proxy, that already exists today. And you can scope the write keys, where you're able to actually write data into and read from it. And you can scope down so that you don't leak outside. So something that becomes possible is to write an API server that allows you to create one of these proxies and either serve it out as a wrapped API, or you can serve it out by making a service somewhere and exposing a key. But it doesn't require any changes to the storage layer itself. You just point to the aggregated API server, the one you're trying to aggregate in, to a different etcd, and it writes to it as normal. And that, if you wire it up cleverly, can actually be the same etcd that the Kube API server writes to. And so there's a project to explore that idea for the Google Summer of Code. And I actually don't know, I've never pronounced Xmudri's name before. Are you on the call?
Yes, I am.
How do you pronounce your name?
Yes, you pronounced it correctly, Marco. I am working as a Google Summer of Code student on this project, and I'm planning to implement such API. Now, if you have any questions, we can answer it now or however you want.
Yeah, so we'll be exploring the idea, seeing what's possible, and hopefully coming out with something that, without any modification, any API server could use today.
Okay. Yeah, so I sent an email. I don't know if people had a chance to read it, though. So in the previous discussions about the storage layer, there are actually two interfaces under discussion. One was the interface of the master API server in Kubernetes that serves all of the existing built-in APIs. So the interface between that API server and the storage backend. And we agreed not to change that in the foreseeable future, because for many reasons, like etcd2 is still not gone, and there are other priorities like all the extension APIs and things like that. And the second interface is actually distinct, which is the interface between aggregated API servers and the storage layer. And for there, basically we agreed that they need to have their own storage, and we recommended etcd as a storage, but actually I don't care what storage they use, and we have some that use different storage, like the core metrics, which was the initial customer for API aggregation. But the intent for the combination of both of those two things was actually to not lock us into any storage API at all, because there are known things that I want to change at least, but I believe we have to change in the storage layer. And the other issue is that the etcd API is actually gRPC, and the current policy from SIG architecture is that gRPC should only be used in extension APIs where the API is imperative. There's a single in-system client and a small number of server implementations, and especially for the case where we don't have to worry about authentication and authorization, like for same node calls. And this does actually not meet those requirements. So I'd say, if we want to experiment with building a service that aggregated API servers can use as a standalone thing, that's totally fine. That's not different than each one running their own etcd server. That's a fine thing to explore. But as far as like adding any support to Kube Aggregator or the Kubernetes API server, we should not do that at this time.
So there's good news, right? The good news is that since it is just serving the etcd API, it is not actually locking into any different API server storage. The API server storage for aggregated API servers today is identical to the one that the Kube API server uses today. It's the exact same
etcd where?
I beg your pardon?
Exposing etcd where? Like through what server is the etcd API going to be exposed to this?
Well, there are choices there, right? One choice is that you can project a service somewhere, right? And if you project a service, then it could be anywhere. One choice is that if you're clever about how you write an aggregated API server, you could actually tunnel it if you wanted to. Don't know that you should or whether it would be a likely thing to do.
So I think what Brian is asking is there a endpoint on the main API server that serves a gRPC API?
No, because it wouldn't be compatible.
Right. Yeah. So just to reemphasize something that maybe was missed about what I said the point was to not lock us into any API, and that includes the etcd3 API.
So maybe I'll rephrase this, which is as far as I see it, it's David, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you're saying you are effectively talking about an endpoint that exposes an arbitrary HTTP-ish HTTP2 endpoint that happens to talk to an etcd server on the background, quote unquote, as a service. So in a sense, like, is the primary thing here, like, we wouldn't stop anyone from running something like this on Kube today. It's more the coupling to the API server and the API semantics that we endorse by putting it in the API server is the issue. Is that fair?
I think I'm concerned about that. I'm not sure
Yes.
if that's what Brian was saying.
Yeah, I mean, so just as an example of some of the changes that we need to make, I think as we've changed API objects progress them through different versions and move them to across API groups and change the names of the resources, although one should argue whether we should still do that or not. We've learned some things about how the storage is organized that could be improved, to put it mildly. There's also the issue of sharding, which was brought up recently, the resource version obfuscation, which was brought up just a few minutes ago. And since before Kubernetes existed, I've wanted to change the storage to actually store the objects by UID and to have the name be assembly. But with the semantics of etcd2, we cannot actually do that. It's how Borgmaster works. It's how Omega works.
And notably, even with we wouldn't want people to use the etcd3 API to do that, because then everybody would have to implement it themselves.
Yeah, maybe I feel like we're coming at this from two different perspectives as well as, and I think the trigger word here is API, which if somebody created a service and they hit services /namespace/name/proxy and talk to it, that's really not something that we have. Like, that's why we have Kube. I think if for this to even really be palatable, the best way to prove the idea is like any other extension to Kube. The fact that it may actually have relevance, a very pragmatic short-term relevance for people building aggregated API servers, I think is meritorious, but I don't, like, it has to prove itself without being in the binaries no matter what.
Yeah,
I don't even see this as an extension to Kube. Really, it's more just a way of getting an etcd store.
That seems fine. And I have an unwritten, written but not sent email on this thread because I got distracted, suggesting just serving this from a known Kubernetes service. Like we have the default one, although hopefully we can not hack it in like we hacked the default.
Well, it's almost like a layered detail. Like, prove it as a layer that someone could consume from an aggregated service without getting too fixated on where
the other thing I was going to say is I would like the main Kubernetes API server to consume this, not serve it, right? Like, I'd actually, if you're building in namespace protection, like, that would be kind of handy to have some assurance from the main API server that it doesn't have path traversal bugs.
And David, maybe our mental models are out of date. Like, I feel like this is the dual to the etcd operator, where the etcd operator is you create an extension CRD that says I want an etcd cluster, and this is the dual to that, which says I created something that something fulfilled that gave me a key space, and I don't really care what it is. Like, it's just not a detail I care about.
Yeah, and so you get back here's your write key, and here is the location you can write to, and it would be a service DNS name. Yeah, that's the way I see it. It's something that we have. There's a separate repo started to look into doing it. It can be built completely outside of Kube, but I suspect that the primary consumers will be people in Kube trying to actually have storage for their aggregated API server, and there'd be different ways of fulfilling it, right? On platforms that would allow you to write to etcd in a shared space, it would work there. Those that don't, I guess they would create their own.
This is starting to sound like something that you would want to use by the service catalog mechanism.
Not if you value
the question of how you expose it, not a.
I mean, service catalog is like raw or detached consumer, but you could just as easily say like it's a CRD type. I mean, it's basically somebody creates something somewhere and gets some keys. The details are really hidden behind.
So does this actually require any changes to the main API server? Like, if the problem is that if people are running for aggregated API servers and they don't want to have to deal with running for etcds, and they don't want those etcds to have root or things like that, then if this service were stood up, they could all use this, and it has no implications on whether the etcd for the cluster uses it?
That's right. I don't think any of us have an intent. Well, me and Stefan and Marco don't plan to try to change the etcd storage for Kube API server. If you want namespace today, you can actually build your own or you can run your own gRPC proxy already to do it for etcd.
Yeah, I think the only objectionable part of this is building it into the main API server.
Yeah, exactly.
There was some other thing I was gonna. Say something, but
But by the way, if you have more summer code students, the issues I mentioned with the storage layer would be great projects for them. To go design and prototype those things, because those are long-standing things, and now that etcd2 deprecation is on the horizon, that'd be good to have an answer for, why don't we have a pluggable storage API? And it's because we don't know what the storage API should be because we haven't solved those problems.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see arguments that the storage API is actually is fundamentally imperative, and also arguments that it would be better if we structured it basically like a Kubernetes, like a content agnostic Kubernetes object, where we could implement like UID storage and stuff in some UID lookup, indexing in some component, where we can provide those for all resources, regardless of whether they're CRDs or built-ins.
Yeah, I mean, not that I don't think being able to index and find things by UID is important, but
that's not the reason to do it.
Okay, I'm looking at it and saying it doesn't seem as important as some of the other things.
That's not the reason to do it. I mean, the reason to do it is more for things like to have a fixed name that doesn't change as we rev API types. It's to be able to serve the final state of the object to asynchronous consumers post-deletion, provide cleaner semantics around edge cases with respect to deletion preconditions and things like that.
So the reason why I think it's important that it be done once somewhere that everybody can reuse is the risk of fragmenting the ecosystem, like having various APIs that don't behave in the same way.
Yeah.
And I think that's no good for clients. Then if you don't know what you can expect from a Kubernetes resource, then we haven't really built the right kind of platform.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we've been discussing too, is what conformance tests do we need? So the watch tests are underway. Thank you very much, Ginny. I think we really need solid tests around the etcd behaviors that we're dependent on, because we have seen with the console PR and the DynamoDB proposal and others that it's inevitable that people will be trying to swap in other backends, even if the upstream doesn't strictly support it, either with an etcd3 proxy translation layer or some other approach. So it's really imperative that we actually get tests for watch and optimistic concurrency and whatever other behaviors we think there are that currently we just kind of inherit those behaviors from etcd. I would also like some tests to help guard against people building dependencies on things that we actually don't guarantee.
Like the resource version?
Well, the resource version and the sharding thing, like the multiple resource types are actually in the same etcd instance. Because currently we do not guarantee that for any resource types.
Yeah. One effective way to currently the way that that's accidentally exposed is that the resource versions come out of the same pool.
Right.
So if we obfuscated those, that would probably detect most assumptions of that.
But if we do that, and the need is that people need at least a per resource instance, a per object sequence number. And so
we have generation for.
It's not implemented for very many resources.
This is a reason for implementing things in a common place. Common functionality should be implemented in a common place.
Yeah. So anyway, I think we're done with this. I think my concerns are alleviated by the decoupled nature of the proposal.
Oh, I remember what I was going to say, which is I've talked to a lot of people trying to write some sort of extension, whether it's aggregated API or CRD. And everybody hates, they say they hate etcd, or they don't like the thought of operating etcd. I think the actual thing that people are saying or thinking is that they don't want to operate their own storage. They're not objecting to etcd. They're objecting to the operation part of that. So
they're not objecting to etcd specifically.
Right. Yeah. There's no like. I think people just don't care about their storage. Like they just want something that works, and they don't want to think about it, and that's why they don't want to operate it. So if we can offer a standardized etcd endpoint in a cluster, I think that would actually make a lot of people really happy because they could use that without thinking about it. And I don't know how we want to look that up, but I think it's something that we could keep in an ongoing manner. We could even, if we have a centralized location, we can make that centralized location begin to serve a actual real storage API.
So that gets into the issue. Then we're really saying that forever we're offering an etcd3 API. Which I don't think we're ready to say.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to promise it's forever.
We haven't even exercised very many etcd3, like the full range of etcd3 behaviors. So
we're effectively, our hands are tied because we still have to support etcd2.
Yeah, but I'm saying like we don't actually have the experience to offer like a fully fledged etcd3 service because we're actually only exercising a small part of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I wouldn't expect it to be a standardized thing. I would expect it to be, if you are running an API server and you are using the etcd3 backend, you can point it at a service, and then you can either run just an etcd at that service, which you can do today, or if you want to point a bunch of things, a bunch of different API servers at it and shard them off and not just trust that they're playing nicely in their own space, then you can run this thing that is being proposed to experiment with that could do that sharding for you, or protection for you.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Looks like we have one late-breaking item. Mike, do you want to say something?
Sure. So I'm looking at using Kubernetes API Machinery to build other distributed systems. So I need to be able to do things like predict its throughput and scale it if necessary. I'm working on characterizing what I can get now. It's turning out to be a little bit more work than I expected. I was wondering what the group is willing to assert that a designer can expect in terms of how API servers transform Kubernetes API load into etcd API load.
So you're talking about like what's the ratio of you do a get, how many gets on etcd does that do? You do a put, how many get put combos does that do?
That kind of thing, yes. That would be the place to start because it's a little easier to yeah, I mean, etcd is a little more basic, right? And if I knew how to transform between the two, that helps.
Yeah.
Do we have to do it? I guess we do have to do a get even for puts. And we definitely have to do it for patch.
Patches. We don't do a get for updates.
Yes, we do.
We do a get for updates?
Yes.
Have to. We have to send the admission.
Old and new get patch to admission and validation.
Yeah, forgot.
Yeah, I mean that seems like it should be reasonable-ish given the existing backend.
Actually, there's an optimization for that, so it will. The first attempt will pull out of the cache. So the API server is maintaining a cache because it uses that to feed its watches, and it optimistically, the first time through, tries with the cached version as the current version. And if that hits a conflict, then it does a get.
I have heard rumors that we're like violating that, like that's not a consistent read. So we don't necessarily take the current version of the object and present that as the real current version. And that
read get does not hit that cache, and update is safe because it will fail on resource version conflict, and so then it will get live again.
Okay.
So in most cases, if it's not under contention, an update does not require a get.
So do we have metrics from exported about the hit rate? You know,
we published some latency metrics. I don't know if we publish like etcd read or write request metrics. We should.
We lost when we moved to gRPC. When we moved to etcd3, we lost most of the metrics. So there isn't. It's not in the API server today. We don't have the same level of granularity. You can approximate the hit rate probably just by knowing what queries hit the watch cache, but we could do a better job of saying which ones are served by the watch cache.
Yeah. And then as Jordan and I discovered, patches currently might do a bunch of unnecessary retries.
Well, they definitely, in certain cases, do.
Yeah.
They just like retry 5 times even though they're all going to fail.
So,
all the retries are going to fail.
I wrote that up in an issue, and Jordan already has a PR up to like remove some of these.
Okay.
Now that I made this code a little bit more understandable. Yeah. So.
Okay, so one simple ask then would be, is there a maintained, or would you guys agree it'd be reasonable to maintain a document that describes the relationship between Kube API load and etcd API load?
I think that's completely reasonable.
Yeah, and if we do make storage layer changes, like breaking out a single resource into multiple resources or whatever, it would be a change to that document, but that's fine.
Yeah, and we can, we already do some testing of things like that, like the scale tests our SLO. Like we could put this in metrics and get it out of the scale tests. So an issue with getting it out of scale tests is sometimes our scale tests test like things within a single namespace instead of multiple things in multiple namespaces.
Well, that should be, we should improve the scalability test probably.
It's the number of features in Kubernetes is high enough that there's a combinatorial explosion of combinations. So, yeah. So our
yes, I can see that. I can appreciate that could be an issue.
But
so,
I assume that you're still planning to pursue the sharding.
Not necessarily. Again, if I can convince myself that I can get adequate throughput without it, then obviously it's easier to not do extra work.
Right. Yeah. So just to be clear, one thing I did, I'm pretty sure I documented in the resource model doc, which is merged now, was it was the intent to always ensure that we could shard by resource type. Sharding within a resource type, I believe the approach you suggested should also be legal, should also work.
So hang on, I'm still not seeing. You need to be able to have an absolute order on your resource version, whether it's inspectable or not. A client has to be able to say, I want to watch from resource version X.
So before we move on to the sharding, let's just finish this first part, which is documenting the relationship. So where's the actionable item here? Is somebody going to start this document? Should I try to start it, or does someone else in the group want to start it, or what?
I think we'd be thrilled if you started it. If that's
I think it's if you look at the generic generic registry implementation, I think that should give you a pretty clear idea.
It's a combination of that and the storage backend. So that plus the etcd3 implementation, you can see what actual calls happen.
Yeah, and I think since the number of retries, you can't statically analyze that. Like actually measuring it and test what we do empirically has probably more value than a static analysis. I think a static analysis, you'll find that there's like, yeah, I could guess, but I won't. I think it would be more useful to measure empirically what it is under load.
Okay.
Okay, so that adds an action item, but let me first finish off the first action item. If I was to start a document, where should I put it?
Where do we put the scalability SLO documentation?
Well, that's probably in SIG scalability, I would guess. This one I would actually put into the community contributors design proposals API machinery, the API machinery subpart. This is the design part of the design proposals.
Like our targets?
Well, what we believe the existing design does.
Okay.
Like if we're going to add design documentation about the way things are,
okay,
that's kind of where it belongs. It's not a new proposal. We're not changing anything. Documentation about how things work. It's kind of at a level of detail that hopefully users do not.
As Kubernetes proposal or community
contributors, design proposals, API machinery.
One thing I am curious about, are you counting in your how many requests you get out? Like you make a request with a service account token, and so we have to verify that that service account UID matches. Are you including that as the API request for the get of the pod that you wanted, or are you including that as a separate one since it has different get requests associated with it?
I think the point of this is to characterize the performance of the system. So any etcd reads or writes are fair game, not just one specifically about the resource that's being written.
Yeah. So you're going to end up.
Yeah. So if you read
very load dependent.
Yeah.
Are back.
Yeah.
Most of the ones that are sort of layer dependencies are fed either off of caches or have some TTL cache on them, so that if you hit the API server with 1,000 requests, you're not going to get 1,000 hits. So
just noting that depending on, like, I could make some really perverse loads that do pretty bonkers things.
I'm pretty sure you already do.
Right.
It's a
It's a caching for reads. Obviously, the performance of the cache is dependent on the request mix.
Yep.
And for many things there will be dependencies. In general, there's always a dependency on the usage pattern. So, just something that outlines it, right? So that a designer has some idea of what to expect, what the range of variation is, what are the relevant issues. That's what I think would be useful for someone who wants to use this machinery for other purposes.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the other action I was just suggested was then to set up some regular monitoring as part of the scale testing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's two sub items, which is add
metrics.
Yeah, start publishing the metrics and then start collecting them.
Right. Oh. Well, yes, I'm going to say split it, but there's publish, and then maybe it's not separate. I don't know. There's one thing is to get the metrics out, however they're normally getting out, and then is there? I guess I don't know if there is. Is there any regular comparison of testing results to goals, or?
Yes, the scalability tests, at least some of them, extract latency measurements and compare them to the SLO. Like actually do statistics and extract the P99 and compare that to the SLO, I believe.
Okay. So the next question, but we don't have an SLO on this, so there's no comparison to do yet.
We don't have an SLO on this.
You could just graph the data.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you can get graphs from the performance.
We have a dashboard that does graphing that just graphs results.
Yeah, so we can look through that and publish them. Publishing them there would be great.
Now that graphing, as far as I can tell, is just pretty direct visualization of the collected data. They don't really have any reduction or analysis capability in that dashboard.
That's probably true. Presumably somebody in SIG scalability would be a better person to ask about.
Okay.
If you drill down into the individual test runs, there's more raw data available, like percentiles and buckets and things like that, that doesn't get bubbled up to the top level graphs. We usually dig into that when we're trying to track down a particular issue, but that some of it is captured. It's a balance between how much data gets retained from the runs versus not blowing up our storage.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes, I've been wondering about that. That's always the problem with keeping metrics, isn't it?
Yeah.
we want to be careful about the cardinality of the metrics we collect.
The graph of our scalability test buckets is up and to the right.
All right, we're getting close on time. Anything else on this topic, or any last minute topics that can be done in like a minute?
I did want to mention the discussion about sharding within a resource. I don't think there's actually enough information in the resource version today to do that.
Well, so the idea that I was thinking would be something like the following. I had two ideas, but someone pointed out that the wash cache shoots one of them down. So the approach that might work would be to introduce a sharding layer in front of a bunch of shards of API servers. And this sharding layer When it speaks to the backend API servers, it'll use their resource versions as they are today. When it speaks to clients, it'll use a version vector, which is a list of shard and backend resource version, backend resource version, shard and backend resource version pairs, a list of those pairs. And that's what it speaks to the clients.
And it maintains the absolute ordering of all versions received?
Yes.
So the trick is that when you're doing a watch, right, that watch has to get split up against the backend API servers that are going to stream into their own independent streams. But this, the sharding layer has to merge those streams into one stream and send.
And remember the order that it merged them in.
It has, well, but the important thing is that it is remembering. The trick is it is serializing. So there is some bit of logic that's handling one notification at a time, and that bit of logic can construct a sequence of version vectors that are totally ordered. And it's a very simple idea. It's just for every notification that gets passed along, it's just keeping a current version vector, and it updates the appropriate field or member of that version vector, incrementing the setting the resource version according to the notification it's passing along.
And it is able to, for any past version vector, play the ordered set of watches.
So any version vector that it hands out to a client, the client can come back and say, get me a new watch from this point, right? And that'll work because for every backend shard, it knows the resource version to hand to that backend shard and say, watch from that point.
This has from any point, but if you replay twice, you wouldn't necessarily get the same sequence.
That would be true.
Yeah. Which I think is okay.
Yeah, I think that should be fine. So the ordering, yeah, I mean, you just need a map of the shards to resource versions. The ordering can be made consistent. It doesn't need to be made permanently consistent for all time from all API servers, just for a given one that can be.
I think it's for a given client that matters. A given client needs to be able to say, a list or a watch, and then whatever it saw from that list or watch, it needs to say, give me a watch from that point.
Yeah, so I really hope that you don't find it necessary to do this because it sounds like a lot of work. And
I agree. So I first want to pursue just characterizing the throughput that I can get without it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure this came up in discussions a few years ago. So yeah, I'm pretty sure it's possible.
I think it should be possible, but I don't know that it's the way that we would really want to do starting.
We've avoided it so far.
Yeah. All right.
So as this I just mentioned, just a simple an announcement. I'm removing Swagger 1.2. I'm preparing a PR. If you have any objection, talk with me.
When was it deprecated?
It's deprecated 2 releases ago, I guess. I can look. The issue is actually tracking all of the announcements we did.
Okay.
And in 1.11, we will not have Swagger 1.2.
Okay. I think we need to make some kind of explicit statement in the deprecation policy about which policy applies to it.
Yeah. As we mentioned earlier with the Open API stuff, someone was literally just this morning asking, oh, well, I found this per API group schema doc under Swagger API version group. And I was saying, oh, yeah, that's about to go away. So it's certainly not widely known. I don't even know that most people understand the difference between Swagger and Open API. They're just looking for schema docs wherever they can go.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's at least worth an email.
I did send various emails. I will send another one.
Well, this is not just a dev issue. This is a user-facing API.
Yeah, so
I'll send it to dev and
maybe
it's consumed by more than just keep control out in the wild.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe Kubernetes announces a.
So yeah, I think there's a legitimate question about whether it falls under the year deprecation policy or not.
Oh, okay. So maybe we should sort that out before we send a Kubernetes announce email.
Yeah. I mean, saying that we don't actually support Swagger for new APIs that get added is different than removing the support for existing ones.
Okay, I'll check on that.
All right.
I'll check on the policy.
We are at time, so thanks everybody. See you later after KubeCon. Bye.